Difficulties in solving the global problems. Introduction. Global problems are not just challenges that affect many people. Rather, they are problems that affect the entire universe and potentially all living things on Earth. Climate change is an example that quickly comes to mind when a global problem is mentioned. This is because the consequences of any activity that causes changes in the atmosphere will eventually affect the other regions on the planet in one way or another. In other words, the consequences are universal. Unless everyone profoundly agrees to cooperate and join hands in changing behavior toward environmental conservation, climate change may result in an irreversible problem. Besides, there is no easy solution to the problem, as has been witnessed in past efforts of the international community in handling these challenges. Moreover, these difficulties are linked to political and economic constraints, lack of power and cooperation, legitimacy issues, poverty, mixed reactions, and inappropriate technology, as this paper seeks to discuss. Political constraints. Political constraint is a critical factor that makes it difficult for the international community to solve global issues. Many multinational institutions are powerless to influence the global economic and political framework. Most international communities depend on member states to perform their duties, including peacekeeping and peacemaking. As a result, their success is primarily dependent on the member nations' willingness to collaborate and contribute resources to their goals. For instance, since the United States and the Soviet Union were non-members of the League of Nations, the League was unable to intervene in violent conflicts in Manchuria, Ethiopia, and sections of Latin America. This indicates how hard it is for the international communities to solve global issues considering the political influence. On the other hand, the United Nations tools for managing conflicts have primarily proved irrelevant considering the situation at hand. For instance, in his final year in office, former U.S. President Donald Trump took a massive disruptive political approach to the organization, looking for avenues to embarrass China, which seemed to heighten the tension between the two countries. Moreover, the UN body has become more civil but not enormously influential in managing crises due to these dogmatic effects. The U.S. and its geopolitical rivals, China and Russia, have shown little interest in supporting the new United Nations Security Council (UNSC) initiative to stabilize peace in areas such as the Sahel, which caused a vexed reaction from France. As a result, the UN finds it difficult to deploy the counter-terror group to enforce peace in these regions. Lack of power and independence to implement policies. The emergence of the Cold War showed that most intergovernmental organizations lacked the power to enforce their duties. During the Cold War, the UNSC was rendered powerless and ineffective due to the ideological differences between its member states. The NATO and the Warsaw Organization Treaty were victims of this problem. Thus, the US and the Soviet Union engaged in a nuclear arms race without constraints, despite the dangers that came with it. This evokes questions about the dependence of international communities on member states to implement their initiatives. This supports the view that, at times, the UN and other international communities are used as tools to pursue the interest of foreign policy goals, thereby creating excellent resistance among other members to change and adhere to these policies. Economic constraints. Economic constraints such as underfunding and understaffing pose a significant challenge to the international communities in handling global problems. The organizations depend primarily on the members' contributions for their funding and staffing. The magnitude of these contributions is determined by the gross domestic product of each country. Due to insufficient funding, inappropriate state intervention, and understaffing at the start of World War II, the UN and its agencies were unable to avoid the conflict. Further research shows that up to 2002, the United Nations' budget was only $10 billion, which is a significantly smaller amount than most countries' budgets. Additionally, the historical analogies reveal that some member countries default on their contributions to international communities, causing financial constraints among these bodies. A good example is the US, which at the end of September 1999, owed the UN $1.6 billion. This limits the organization's financial capacity to employ adequate staff required to facilitate the enforcement of its policies, consequently making it difficult to solve international problems. Lack of trust in the legitimacy of international organizations. The legitimacy of some international organizations has, at one point, been questioned. Organizations such as the EU, WTO, UN, and international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, at some point, have had their operations questioned. The magnification of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter and the hypothetical outweighs the UNSC in the post-Gulf War raised legitimacy questions about the UNSC and its decisions. This can be traced to the airplane bombing at Lockerbie that left 259 passengers dead. Following the disaster, the United States and the United Kingdom of Great Britain petitioned the UNSC to have Libya, which was accused of organizing the bombing, release the suspects to them. The Libyan government defied this demand and instead went to the International Court of Justice, ICJ, to seek protection to interrogate the suspects on their own. On the contrary, the UK and the US proceeded to use Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to force the Libyan government to comply with their demand. This resulted in the withdrawal of the case from the ICJ. This posed legitimacy questions about the actions of the international communities. Furthermore, this led to a different view of the international community's role as those meant to solve the interest of their member states, hence losing its trust and making it difficult for other organizations to cooperate and combine efforts in solving world problems. Poverty, mixed reactions, and inappropriate technology. The 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, for instance, unveiled that making changes from using fossil fuels to using renewable energy created a mixed reaction between the developing countries and the developed countries. In the conference meeting, Bhupender Yadav argued, richer nations should not expect poorer countries to stop subsidizing fossil fuels such as gas. The lowest income households rely on these to keep energy costs down. This shows that poverty and lack of appropriate technology form the basis for limiting international communities like the UN to perform their mandate. Conclusion. In conclusion, international communities face multifaceted difficulties in solving global issues, but political constraints, lack of power and cooperation, economic constraints, legitimacy issues, and lack of corporations are among the most prominent ones. These challenges mainly manifest in the UN, thereby acting as a reference guide to the key stakeholders of global governance. To overcome some of these challenges, the international community needs to be fully financially capacitated and uphold complete independence and integrity in its operations.